The hum of the airport was constant, a mixture of rolling suitcases, overhead announcements, and the occasional chatter of excited passengers. It was a scene familiar to anyone who had flown. People bustling through the terminals, eager to get to their next destination. At Gate 32, the passengers gathered, some with nervous anticipation, others with tired eyes from long journeys. Families hugged goodbye, businessmen tapped away on laptops, and a few parents tried to calm crying babies. The excitement in the air was palpable. A flight meant new opportunities, vacations, or reunions for most. Among the crowd, a black flight attendant stood with calm professionalism. She moved efficiently, directing passengers to their seats with a warm smile, offering assistance where needed. Her uniform was crisp, her movements smooth and practiced, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. She didn't need to say much. Her presence spoke volumes. A gentle nod here, a quiet word there. She managed the cabin with ease, making sure everyone was settled and comfortable, all while maintaining the sense of order that was essential in this busy environment. As passengers continued boarding, she paused to check her watch, glancing briefly toward the cockpit where the pilot should have been preparing. Her expression remained neutral, but it was clear she was focused, professional, fully committed to ensuring the smooth operation of the flight ahead. For her, this wasn't just a job. It was a place to be proud of, a place where every detail mattered. Her eyes scanned the boarding area, always alert, always ready. The flight was about to take off, and she was determined to make sure it did, without a hitch. The cockpit was dimly lit, the soft hum of the plane's systems filling the air as the white pilot adjusted his uniform. His hands were steady as he ran through the pre-flight checklist, each task performed with the precision of someone who had done this countless times before. The flight was important. After all, he was in charge. He was the one who held the keys to the plane, the one who controlled the sky. As he flicked switches and adjusted dials, he glanced out the cockpit window, observing the busy tarmac below. But his gaze soon turned toward the crew boarding the plane. He watched them with a sense of quiet judgment. His eyes landed on the flight attendant, a black woman, moving with grace and purpose, ensuring that everything was in order. There was something in his demeanor, something in the way he tilted his head slightly, as if scrutinizing her movements. She was efficient, yes, but to him, that didn't matter. What mattered was her place in the hierarchy, her role on the plane, in the airline, in the world. He couldn't help but feel a sense of superiority, an unspoken belief that his position as the pilot gave him a certain privilege, a status above the rest. He briefly adjusted his collar and stared at the crew once more, his gaze lingering on the flight attendant. Something about her struck him the wrong way. She was too confident, too poised for someone who wasn't supposed to be there. At least, not in his mind. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the tasks at hand. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done about it. The pilot pushed open the cockpit door and stepped into the narrow aisle, his boots making a soft thud on the cabin floor. He stood tall, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the crew as if assessing them. His gaze eventually landed on the flight attendant, who was assisting a passenger with their overhead bag. Without warning, he began walking toward her, his expression one of quiet disdain. The moment she noticed his approach, she straightened up, preparing to greet him with the same professionalism she had shown all day. But as he got closer, she felt an unsettling tension in the air, something she couldn't quite place. He stopped in front of her, his eyes cold and calculating. "Well, I didn't expect to see someone like you in a job like this," he said, his voice low but laced with a sneer. The words hung in the air, sharp and pointed. It wasn't just a comment on her role. It was a statement of superiority. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing, almost daring her to react. She paused for a moment, her heart skipping a beat. His words weren't just rude. They were loaded with an underlying prejudice. The discomfort grew as he continued to stare, his smug smile betraying a belief that she didn't belong there, that this was somehow his domain, and she was out of place. Trying to hold her ground, the flight attendant gave a small, professional smile, but inside, she felt a wave of unease. His tone, his words, they weren't just directed at her. They were a subtle reminder of everything he thought she was beneath. She could feel the tension building, the weight of his judgment pressing against her. The pilot's sneer deepened as he took another step closer. His eyes never left her, his stance growing more imposing. "I need you to leave the plane," he said, his voice dripping with authority. "Now." The flight attendant blinked, taken aback. She had seen difficult passengers, but this was different. She tried to keep her composure, but the words hit her like a slap in the face. "You're kidding, right?" she asked, her voice steady but incredulous. The pilot didn't flinch. "No, I'm serious. You don't belong here. This job, this plane, it's not for someone like you." His words hung in the air, thick with contempt. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was a blatant declaration of his prejudice. She stood frozen for a second, trying to process the audacity of his demand. The passengers around her continued to chat and settle in, oblivious to the tension unfolding just a few feet away. But the flight attendant felt every second stretch out, the weight of his words pressing down on her. It wasn't just the request to leave. It was the reason behind it, clear as day. Her breath caught for a moment, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. But she quickly masked it, her expression returning to a calm professionalism. She knew she couldn't let him see her react. "You're asking me to leave the plane. Because of my race," she said slowly, as if giving him the chance to rethink what he'd just said. The pilot nodded, his eyes unwavering. There was no apology, no hesitation. He truly believed she had no place here, just because of who she was. The flight attendant stood her ground, though the sting of his words was undeniable. It was clear he thought his position gave him the right to dismiss her, to force her off the plane without reason. But she wasn't going anywhere. The tension in the cabin was palpable, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the plane's engines. The pilot stood there, arms crossed, as if his demand was final. The flight attendant remained calm, her gaze locked on him, but her mind was racing. This moment felt like a breaking point, and she could feel the weight of the passengers around them, some unaware of the unfolding conflict, others now starting to shift in their seats, sensing something wasn't right. Just as the pilot opened his mouth to say something else, a voice interrupted the rising tension. A quiet, authoritative voice that seemed to cut through the charged air. "Is there a problem here?" The words were simple, but the tone was firm and unyielding. Every head in the cabin turned toward the source of the voice. The flight attendant's eyes widened slightly as she looked past the pilot. In the back of the cabin, a man stood slowly, his presence commanding the room despite the fact that no one had noticed him until now. The black airline owner, who had been sitting among the passengers, rose to his feet. He was a tall, composed figure, his expression calm but serious. He hadn't drawn attention to himself earlier, blending in with the crowd as he sat quietly among the passengers, observing. But now, as he made his way down the aisle, the entire atmosphere shifted. The pilot looked at him with confusion, his posture stiffening. The flight attendant, though startled by the interruption, felt a wave of relief wash over her as the owner approached, standing tall and unafraid. Without a hint of recognition from the pilot, the owner stopped in front of him, his gaze unwavering. There was no hesitation in his voice when he asked again, "Is there a problem here?" The room seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't just a question, it was a statement. And the passengers could feel it. The energy had shifted, and it was clear something was about to happen. The pilot's confusion was evident as he looked the man up and down, his brow furrowing. The tension in the cabin was palpable, the passengers now fully aware that something significant was unfolding. The pilot, trying to regain control of the situation, stood taller and scoffed. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "What's your business here?" The owner didn't flinch, his gaze never leaving the pilot's. Slowly, a slight smile appeared on his face, but there was no warmth in it. Only the calm certainty that this moment would be his to command. "I'm the owner of this airline," the man replied, his voice clear and unwavering. For a moment, the words didn't seem to register. The pilot blinked, looking at the man in disbelief, as if trying to process what had just been said. His eyes flickered between the owner and the flight attendant who was standing by watching the exchange unfold with quiet intensity. The pilot's smug expression began to falter, his mouth opening and closing, as if searching for the right words. His confidence, which had been so certain just moments ago, crumbled. It was as though the very ground beneath him had shifted. The passengers watched in silence, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy in the air. The pilot's face turned pale as the reality sank in. He had just targeted the wrong person, the owner of the entire airline no less. His arrogance, once so palpable, evaporated in an instant. The self-assured air he had carried now seemed completely out of place. His posture slouched, and the words that followed were nearly lost in the sudden rush of guilt and realization. "Why you?" he stammered, his voice breaking. The owner didn't wait for the pilot to finish fumbling with his words. With steady steps, he moved forward, his presence commanding attention. The plane seemed to hold its breath as he approached the pilot, his eyes locked on the man who had just made a grievous mistake. "Your actions are unacceptable," the owner said, his voice steady and firm, carrying across the cabin with quiet authority. There was no anger in his tone, just a calm, undeniable truth. "You've crossed a line, and I will not tolerate it." The pilot, still visibly shaken, took a small step back. His eyes darted around the cabin as though looking for support, or perhaps a way out. But the room was silent, every passenger watching, every crew member listening. There was nowhere to hide. The owner continued, turning his gaze to the rest of the crew, then to the passengers. His words were clear, carrying a weight that resonated throughout the aircraft. "To every member of my team and to every passenger on this flight," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word, "I want to make something abundantly clear. Discrimination has no place in this airline. Not now, not ever. We operate with respect, fairness, and dignity for everyone, regardless of their race, their background, or their role." He paused, letting the gravity of his statement sink in, his eyes scanning the room. The flight attendant, standing off to the side, felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. The owner's words were a shield, a declaration that what had just happened was not just wrong but unacceptable. The passengers, who had been quietly observing the situation, nodded in agreement. There was a sense of unity, now a shared understanding that this was bigger than just a disagreement between two people. It was a stand for respect, for equality, for what was right. The owner turned back to the pilot, his eyes unwavering. "You're dismissed. Leave this plane." "Now," he said, his command clear, the decision final. The owner's words hung in the air, final and unyielding. "Leave this plane. Now." The pilot, still stunned, stood frozen for a moment, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to form some kind of protest. But there was nothing to say. The room was watching, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had no defense. His mistake was too big to ignore. With a slow, reluctant movement, he turned toward the cockpit, eyes scanning the cabin one last time. The realization that his career, his position was over, seemed to hit him all at once. He moved toward his things, gathering his bag with trembling hands, avoiding eye contact with anyone around him. The flight attendant stood still, her body tense. She could hardly believe what was happening. She had expected something, maybe a reprimand, maybe an apology, but this was something she hadn't imagined. The man who had just moments ago tried to force her off the plane was now being escorted off by the very owner of the airline. Her emotions were a mixture of relief and disbelief. Relief that this man would no longer have the power to hurt her or anyone else, and disbelief that someone in such a position of authority could act with such blatant racism. She watched as the pilot moved slowly down the aisle, every step seeming heavier than the last. The passengers, who had been eerily silent up until this point, now shifted in their seats, some exchanging looks, others staring at the scene unfolding before them. No one spoke, but the air in the cabin had shifted. It was clear that they were witnessing something significant, something that would ripple far beyond this flight. The pilot reached the door, still not looking back. The crew members near the exit opened it for him, and without a word, he stepped off the plane. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a brief moment, the entire aircraft seemed to exhale, as if releasing a collective breath they didn't even realize they'd been holding. The flight attendant remained where she was, her eyes following the pilot until he was out of sight. Then, without a word, she turned back to her duties, but something had changed. She stood a little taller now, a quiet strength in her posture, knowing that she had just been part of something important. Something that would be remembered long after the plane took off. The owner turned slowly, his gaze softening as he looked at the flight attendant. The tension in the cabin had shifted, and now the focus was on her. She had stood her ground, remained composed under immense pressure, and done her job with grace, even in the face of blatant disrespect. He took a step toward her, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "I just want you to know how much I value your professionalism and dedication," he said, his eyes meeting hers with a reassuring warmth. "What happened today was wrong, and you handled it with incredible poise." The flight attendant, still processing the whirlwind of events, felt a lump form in her throat. She had always worked hard to prove herself, to earn her place, but hearing those words from the owner, the person who truly had the power to make a difference, filled her with a quiet pride she hadn't expected. "You have a place here," the owner continued, his words firm, carrying a weight of truth. "No one, not anyone, should ever make you feel inferior. Not on this airline, not anywhere." For a moment she just stood there, taking it in. His words were a lifeline, something she hadn't realized she needed. In an industry where she had often felt like she had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously to prove her worth, hearing this affirmation felt like a shield against the discrimination that still lurked just beneath the surface. The owner smiled, a brief but powerful gesture. "You are a valuable part of this team, and no one will ever question that again." As the words sank in, she could feel the tension in her body begin to ease. It wasn't just the affirmation that mattered, it was the promise of a space where she could exist as her full, unapologetic self, without fear of being belittled or pushed aside. A place where her worth was recognized not based on her race, but on her skill and dedication. The weight of the moment settled in her chest, a quiet sense of victory blooming within her. She nodded, her heart full, grateful for the unexpected ally standing before her. As the plane took off, the hum of the engines signaled a smooth flight ahead. But beyond the technicalities of the journey, the events that had unfolded would go on to spark important conversations across the world. The incident, and the way the owner had stepped in to support the flight attendant, quickly became a viral topic. News outlets and social media platforms buzzed with discussions about race respect and the need for equality in all areas of life, especially in the workplace. The story of what happened that day at 30,000 feet was more than just a moment. It was a call to action, a reminder that standing up against injustice, no matter how big or small, can make a difference. It was a reflection of the power of allyship, the importance of inclusive workplaces, and the need to create spaces where everyone, no matter their race or background, is valued and respected. The flight attendant continued her duties, a quiet sense of pride in her heart. She knew that the support she had received from the owner wasn't just a personal victory. It was part of something much bigger, something that could help change the way the world viewed equality and respect. She had become a symbol of resilience, and she understood that her actions, along with the actions of others, could help spark real change in society. As the plane cruised on, the message was clear: standing up for what's right and creating inclusive environments benefits us all. Together, we can make the world a better place. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Your support helps us continue to bring important conversations to the forefront. Thank you for watching. Please note the story presented in this video is fictional and not based on real events. It is intended to highlight important issues of race respect and equality in the workplace. While the characters and events are created for storytelling purposes, the themes of standing up against injustice and fostering inclusive environments are very much real and relevant. Thank you for watching.